it seems like we are putting a lot of effort, everyone here, everyone walking around at any given university or really anywhere. I mean, it depends on the context. Some people are just trying to put food on the table. But there's a lot of discourse, there's a lot of thought, there's a lot of people working towards some sort of goal in science or philosophy or history or whatever. And I'm just wondering if all that energy going towards those goals, if there should be any energy that's more directed towards sort of understanding what goal should be reached. Like, it seems like people are trying to find an answer to a riddle that they might not know the actual riddle.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
And I guess I'm already speaking out of my own perspective. But the question is based on that. Like, do you think that's the case? And if it's the case, how do we go about fixing it?
I do. I think that especially in the context and environment of a campus, like the student body is typically comprised of younger people who are like engaging with an institution that is supposedly there to help them ultimately reach whatever goal that is. And also like socially, developmentally, like cognitively, a lot of us, because we are in the same, stage in life, trying to like understand, how do I build a structure so I can live a life that is not even enjoyable but bearable. And stop me if I'm like misinterpreting your question.
Oh, it's okay. So maybe a lot of people are in it for the personal question of how can I do something with my life that makes the burdens of suffering something I can bear.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like, that's something I think about a lot is like, why am I working so hard right now? Like, is this the right use of my youth, and my energy? Are these the right steps to meeting that goal? And also, like, what is my goal? I know the things that I can bear doing for long periods of time, or that excite me, or that I like want to contribute. But that doesn't flow parallel to survival. Like, I enjoy working with children and creating art, and neither of those things are lucrative or are gonna like, make my life, I don't know.
Like, there's not a direct, like very direct way that those things are gonna produce food and shelter.
Right. Yeah.
Apart from this sort of societal infrastructure.
Right. And also just like grappling with and coming to terms with the fact that you have to work that hard for basic survival.
Yeah.
Is a hard one to grapple with, for sure.
Yeah, it seems like just a negative way to view reality.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, I think if you focus all of your energy towards like, man, this sucks, like I don't want to pay rent, like I can't afford groceries, then like you are going to be exhausted, and exactly a negative way to sort of view a reality.
And you wouldn't just give up your passions, say like, okay, well, this isn't a very direct way to feed anyone or produce any shelter. It has to go through this complex, abstract societal ecosystem that seems sort of too lofty. It doesn't, and so, and you would you ever give up your passions for that reason?
Dude, no, absolutely not.
So then they have to contribute to something, and so there has to be something valid about that societal ecosystem. But obviously it should be, that same ecosystem should be connected to the practical stuff too.
Yeah.
And so there is, even I think especially modernly, there's this fear of a sort of top-heavy ecosystem that is too concerned with customer service and too concerned with those sort of things. And like maybe in danger of capsizing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see that on like a large, broad spectrum in terms of like the fact that it's an election year, people discussing the economy, like current events, but also like on an individual level.
Yes. So yeah, these things stack up. Kind of like the first question I asked, like people's individual goals that pertain to themselves and justifying their own existence, if you will, even though it's kind of a hardcore thing to say. And then sort of higher order things that institutions, or I guess individuals nested in institutions, might be pursuing. Aside from that, and we can go back into that, but why is art important? What makes it important?
Art is a thread that connects and informs cultures and groups of people that would otherwise be completely separate. It's like a language that everyone understands to an extent, and I think is innate within humanity. Like our understanding of the functions of like ancient cultures are grounded in the art that they created and the materials that they use, and like where did they get that informs us of like exchanges. And in terms of like the innateness of it, like I mean art and visual language predates written language.
And music might predate speech.
Right, exactly. And I mean also art's important because it makes life livable and worth interacting with. Like that sign and that lamppost and this sidewalk and that building and that bicycle is all art and design.
Okay, and you might have already answered this question indirectly, but just to put it forward, is art something that connects you to a sort of transcendent reality, and sort of related to how it applies to every person in this innate way, or is it better understood more as like a political and cultural tool that might? Well, I just leave it there. Like what?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think probably both correlate, right? Like,
okay.
I think that there are ways in which we as people, individuals, as society, reflect and convey emotional or political experiences that you can really only articulate visually. Like sometimes there aren't words in the language that you speak to process or convey or understand experiences.
Yeah, there's something just ineffable about those things.
And I think that the dialogue that's created visually can be informative of a collective experience. Like you said, like sort of transcending. I think it's really important to separate visual language and art with like the art industry, which, is like galleries, museums, like.
But why should you separate those things?
I think because there's an interaction in the functions of an art industry, which have to do with like, social connections, bureaucracy, money, curation, things of that nature, patrons, right? Like, who do I talk to? Who do I know? Who do I pay so I can get an art showing? Who gets those art showings?
Do you think that force makes art more instrumental or more ideological, and it distorts it from what it should be, or is that part of what it should be?
I think it distorts it. I mean, I think that the notion of good art versus an art worthy of an audience versus the tool that art can be for creating connection.
Okay. So in some sense, it like binds people together.
Yeah, I think it can. I think art the existence of imagery and art and that nature can form and forge those connections for sure.
Does that binding together have to exist in a sort of community that's already there or already exists?
I don't think so. I tried to create that outside of the context of like the art building, right? Everyone in the art building who's already in that context is familiar with their own visual language and style and what they want to say or what they're thinking about. If anything, I think maybe they're too close to themselves in that way.
And does every piece of art say something that you can sort of extract out and, okay, this is what this piece of art says? I assume based on what you said, maybe not.
I think it doesn't have to always be that serious. I think it can just as well be. I'm also down for just absurd art, you know, like, and I think some people create absurd
Y'all
art.
should have set up down there.
Dude, I know. It was wild down there.
Yeah, what are you guys doing?
Talking about art.
Oh, lit.
Yeah,
Art's pretty lit.
art is pretty lit.
Yeah, have fun.
Thanks,
Thanks, man. Have a good one.
I took hold of it last
It's Otto, right? I overheard you saying your name, but it's okay. It just flashed into my mind.
Bro, what?
Because you saw me over there
Oh, yeah.
briefly.
Yeah, with Noah.
Yeah, I said hi to him, yeah.
Yeah.
Either way, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I don't mean
no.
to derail our conversation.
No.
No, not at all.
I was just like,
That's what
how does this guy
conversations
know
are
me?
for.
Is it the Matrix?
Flashed into my mind, dude.
Yeah. Well,
All right.
yeah.
Have a good one, man.
Take care.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Yeah, I think art can be absurd. I think people make usually absurd art because they think that art needs to mean something, and so they try to have a message with the absurdity, but like every kid is innately able to create something visual because they don't have the tools of written language yet, and then it's like pounded out of them.
So art can be just subversive, like just sort of absurd for the sake of absurdity.
Yeah, I think it can be a tool to
Yeah.
to grapple with things inside of you or that you've seen within the world or other people, and it doesn't
Okay.
have to. No one has to see it, you know.
So this is an interesting question. It can be taken in a couple different ways, I guess. But is art always made by you, or is it ever made through you?
That's such a good question. Absolutely, I think it can be made through you. I mean,
And how does that work?
I think the best art is spontaneous and
Yeah.
not intentional. Like,
Okay.
an action for sure can be art, and the best action-based art is not planned. You know, it's spontaneous. Like,
Does art like being made through you correspond to some sort of patterns of reality that exist?
what do you mean?
Like, is reality consistent in certain ways, and maybe even very abstract ways, maybe even very beautiful ways that art can express?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. I think there are patterns of the ways in which humans as a species interpret and interact with the world, and like this rigidity to how the world is, the functions of the world, right? Like,
Okay.
and I think those patterns you can see that through art, for
But-
sure.
Yeah, and you can see, but okay, so the patterns that you're describing are more of these constraints, these rigid patterns, almost like the just the concrete in like a super center or something. Like
Sure.
Just these societal sort of brute patterns, which is fair because those do exist. I guess. I think.
Yeah, I mean that's what you see the most of in art history classes is like religion and politics,
Okay.
right?
And do you think, are there any more subtle patterns that are more sort of beautiful, that are still consistent to reality
Yeah.
itself, that aren't just arbitrary to the person?
Yeah,
You know?
I absolutely, and
Okay.
and this is something I think about a lot in my art
Yeah, yeah.
is like the patterns of like the human. It's this weird flow
Okay.
that is difficult to convey, but like the patterns of the ways, and you know, but you and I have different ideas and definitions of like what a pattern is and the flows, right? But like the ways, I mean, like the first thing that comes to my mind, and I could not tell you why, is like, you know, within art, like the exploration of human connections and the patterns in which, you know, like you might convey bodies connecting, even if it's an abstract way, right? Or like the pattern of, I don't know. I think it's hard to articulate.
And it's like understanding things that might not be sometimes there, but might not be just too complex. Maybe they're too simple. Like you just don't think about them.
Totally. They're just so innate.
Yeah. Like a handshake, for example. Like, why do we do that?
Right.
Like, why do we stick out our hand and shake someone else? Like, grab our hands and shake them?
Yeah, but that is totally something that you see in art, is like hand gestures.
And it's like, and maybe art is exploring those the things underneath what we do without thinking.
It's almost like the alphabet of art in a way.
Okay.
And you know, like, it's so hard to have conversations, I feel, about the presence of art within understanding our place in the world, because it's easy for it to sound pretentious and sort of like diluted in a way.
And so do you think you can be an artist in that regard and still be a sort of materialist?
For sure. I think most artists are materialists.
Okay, and you think, and I'm not saying, I'm not trying to convey this dichotomy between, for example, materialism and Christianity. That's not what I'm trying to do, but more of like materialism and sort of spiritualism.
Yeah.
Like, do you have to have an element of, or can you find that in materialism?
What can find spiritualism within materialism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like that everything is sort of material and can be measured scientifically, and then can you sit in that worldview and still sort of find these beautiful patterns?
Yeah, that makes me think of this artist, Hilma af Klint. Do you know her?
I don't think so.
She explores spiritualism in the creation of symbols and patterns and color and math, like in a way.
That's really cool.
You would like her. She so like Kandinsky is taught as like the main guy to start doing abstract expressionism.
Yeah.
This woman created this like manifesto of like imagery and art that explains her experience with spiritualism and these overarching patterns with like how humans develop and interact and understand the world through very basic forms and structures of the bare bones of visual language and art. So like through colors and through shapes, and like it's funny, but it's so interesting. She's really interesting. She was like, the world's not ready for my art, so I'm gonna lock it away. Don't look at it. Don't share it with the world for like 4 more decades or something like that.
Interesting. Did she pass away before that time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it is like pretty profound to like I'm in art education, which you could probably guess, but learning about human development through these like cognitive social theories, and like taking like lecture upon lectures for it to be conveyed, only to like look at a simple triangle with colors and like, or a series of paintings that don't have any realistic representations but still somehow convey the same thing.
Yeah. I really want to try to find a way to dig into that. So you talked about, I assume those were sort of psychology classes?
Yeah, so like, human development family studies just talks about like understanding like the social, cognitive, and biological development of children and families, so that you can like be a teacher and things like that. Yeah,
that's really cool. So we talked about, briefly, sort of at length, we talked about patterns and if they can be, if their consistency can be interacted with art in beautiful ways. And so what you're saying now, it seems to connect with that. in that there's patterns of our experience that maybe psychologists are trying to analyze and uncover.
Yeah.
And those patterns too, maybe even most profoundly, can be played with in an artistic setting.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that I really think I want to put more intention towards when I'm making art, is like, how to visualize like the development of somebody's like art through like childhood, and like the interpretation of a human just being a circle and sticks, you know, and that conveyed and expressed, and whether that is maintained through like early adolescence, or if you're like, okay, art's not valuable, or my art isn't good enough, so I'm just gonna stop.
Yeah.
But
right, either
yeah,
a bottom up or top down reason to go away, like, oh, I'm not gonna, I don't have the chops for it, or oh, this is not actually valuable to the highest things.
absolutely. That's
Yeah,
a perfect way of saying it. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure.
Sure.
Yeah, I this is making me think a lot of, yeah, you're making me think a lot about the art that I make. I'm in this moment right now, this like intersection of really not liking the art that I make, but also wanting to like maintain the main theme of like exploration and thought, just
Yeah.
like shifting visually.
Yeah.
But something that I'm really interested in is like what aesthetic philosophy is, and why that informs us of. So aesthetic philosophy basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can go ahead and explain it.
It's just like the philosophy of how people interact with art, and a lot of the time that is taught with using the words beauty.
Mm-hmm.
So like, you know, being art, something that's beautiful, evoking an emotion or connecting with you. And my thought to that is like, why is art synonymous with beauty? What defines beauty? Why is there a thread of connection throughout why people understand and view something as beautiful versus ugly?
That
And
is a very profound question.
yeah, and like why can't the ugly be beautiful? Why can't the ugly provoke, and not in a gratuitous and violent way that's like traumatic, but like just in terms of.
Yeah. Do you think, so in some sense, is that your project? You're trying to see if the ugly can be beautiful?
Yeah, and also understanding why, what in our culture and our world and what's ingrained within us, either directly or indirectly informs definitions of that beauty.
So do you think that there's maybe an intimation of beauty in even the most ugly thing?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what kind of ugly you're talking about in the context of it.
Sure.
Like,
maybe like a disfigured person would be, on the face of it, ugly.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to say that in a mean way.
No, it's not mean. No,
Yeah.
I mean like something. The series that I recently just finished up and I'm trying to pull away from is like sculpturally and texturally exploring the textures of our body, our anatomy, like the most intimate parts of the vessels we inhabit, and why there's an objection to that. Like there's an ugliness about it that that brings discomfort, and why the experience of the human body is ugly. Like outside of the context of like, oh, I'm gonna have like a gratuitous like horror movie scene of somebody getting cut up. Like obviously the context of that brutalization is ugly and gratuitous and violent and traumatic. That
So
has an
that's not a
emotional
right
context.
approach.
Right, but I think removing that out of the context, even out of the context of the body itself, like what does that convey?
So how do you go about, maybe this is asking something you're wrestling with right now, and maybe you don't have a good answer for this, but how do you go about pulling out the beauty from these things that are theoretically and theoretically ugly? Like, how do you go about that? What's that process look like?
It's a hard one to answer. I don't know. I think removing it from that context is like kind of
Like a context of
first-
sort of indulging in it for your own egoic intentions.
yeah,
something like that.
yeah, and removing it from the context of like these forms we inhabit,
Okay.
like just flesh is flesh, and I think like in an interaction with that, recontextualizing it. And I don't know how this relates, but recently I've been thinking a lot in terms of the experience of the physical, textures and forms that we inhabit. I've been thinking a lot about, I'm going to show it to you. It's this picture of like the sensory homunculus, which
Oh.
is, yeah, dude, can't stop thinking about that. That's crazy. The way that the body
That's how we feel.
feels and visualizes the body just sort of speaks to this like, I don't know, sort of thing that I'm trying to like wrap my brain around, kind of.
And you'll know that if, like, in certain experiments, people have, like, try to get people to judge the width of their hands based on, and then judge the width of their arms, and just by guessing, they just generally, like, will guess that their hands are bigger. They'll guess
Right.
that their arms are smaller.
Their tongues are bigger.
Based on how they feel in their experience.
Yeah, it's and I so I want to create art that's sensory. I made this sculpture that conveys textures of like viscera, but it's all out of like jam and bubble gum and balloons. And I will ask people like, you touch it, interact with it, like ask yourself why is this gross to you? Because you would eat that jam outside of that context.
Yeah.
And those textures are moving around inside of you right now.
Sure. So is that with the intention of subverting sort of societal expectations or societal norms, or is there something deeper about it that's sort of beyond that intention?
I think both. I think like
Okay.
I think we are encouraged to like, I don't know, sort of have this like disembodiment of ourselves and a disconnect, and it's like, why?
So you want people to come back into their experience instead of viewing everything as this abstract set of like mechanistic sort of causes and effects.
Yeah. Like if
And-
you look at a anatomy textbook, it looks like a blueprint for a robot. But
Yeah.
those things and images are the most intimate parts of you.
Yeah.
And I think that's just interesting. I think visually I like depicting the human body. But
Yeah.
beyond that, like, what does that mean,
So people are trying to take themselves out of the equation
Yeah.
in a way that's completely unhelpful, probably, in the long run.
Yeah, I mean, like, and also, like, to round out back to, like, the point of
Yeah.
individuals grappling with, like, goals, their place in the world, in relation to, like, the overarching goals of the world we inhabit, like, in order to, for me, like, my goal is to, like, figure out how to be comfortable and happy in my life, regardless of what job I have, regardless of whether or not I get my degree, right? Like, those sort of things. And I think that starts with taking a step back into yourself and finding comfort and, like, comfortability in yourself, in your body, in your brain, so that you can then step back into the world, the things that you're passionate about, the places you want to go, and regardless of the communities that you're in or you're not in, you still have, that you have the only thing really, which is like you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's difficult because I want to, maybe I'll just articulate it as a separate perspective. Like, you'd want, it seems like, why not? I feel like I would want to have something other than myself too.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
And I guess you'd accept that too.
Yeah,
Like, there's something outside of myself. I'm not just solipsist.
Right. No, like I mean, this binary definition is pretty stupid, but
Yeah, it
like
shouldn't be one or the other. Yeah. Okay.
but like well, that's me prefacing saying, like, I would consider myself a social, like, an extroverted person.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, I don't want to be okay. I don't want to just be with myself. But, like,
Yeah.
I think I have to be in order to form relationships with longevity. You know what I mean? Like, to form connections and to understand others and why you connect with them or want to
Yeah.
is to first understand you.
Like if you see someone, or even just everybody outside of you, as just like those anatomical models that are just sort of robotic, then you're probably not gonna have any friends.
Yeah, totally. Yeah,
sort of
absolutely.
Yeah.
And also creating, like, I mean, the brain does this, is like you create a narrative for the way that another person's brain is working. Like even right now in this conversation.
Theory of mind. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so, like, and I think that can either be beneficial, but ultimately probably is not, you know?
Really?
I think that, like, you know, like if you assume that somebody thinks a certain thing about you or has a certain goal in mind with their interactions with you,
Okay. Yeah.
you're never going to be completely on the nose. And you don't know, you know?
So it's maybe more of a, like, you have a more balanced approach where you're not trying to just be super presumptive about what you think everyone else is thinking.
Yeah, yeah. And try to, so, and I think that'll,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. For sure. I think that, like, in order, like, you just have to hear the information that someone's conveying to you.
Yeah.
But that's impossible. You know, like, there's always going to be implicit biases, and your experiences are going to inform
Yeah.
how you interpret something.
But isn't that's kind of related to what we were just talking about, as to where, like, there's always at bedrock the implicit bias of your homunculus, your experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so to some degree that seems unavoidable, right?
Right. Yeah. But I think recognizing that is, like, just all you got to do.
And okay, you should recognize it, but because of this sort of inevitability of it, is there any way, especially the bedrock level, and it seems like that's what you're trying to do in your art to some degree too, like, is there any way it should be embraced?
I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
I think so. And having these conversations is, like, how to productively embrace that, you know?
Productively embraced.
I think, and also, like, feels empowering, you know?
Yeah.
I like, for example, something that I've been thinking a lot about is, like, how to confront my implicit, like, and biases that have been ingrained about gender, and how that informs the way that I feel about myself and my place in the world, as well as my interactions.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's really hard. It took me a while to be like, okay, I have ingrained misogyny in me, which manifests through feeling judged by other people, and then, like, implicitly judging them, and, like,
Yeah. And kind of along our the lines of what we're saying, how do you know how much you should give up of your own bias, if you will? Like, bias even being your experiential bias of your homunculus.
Yeah,
Like how
yeah.
how much of it should you give up before it becomes unproductive? Like, is there ever a time where you give up too much? Like, because it seems like the idea of trying to look beyond yourself in this sort of third person point of view that you said was sort of distorting. Was that almost like too much letting go of bias?
yeah.
Where you went overboard and you lost the homunculus that you exist in?
Yeah, I think that, like, if you are so caught up on rejecting that or getting rid of it,
Yeah.
I mean, that, I feel like that, to an extent, is like a losing game, because, like,
Yeah.
there's always going to be embedded biases you're not even aware of. But
Yeah.
even if you're aware of them, you know, you're not going to just get rid of them.
So is there a clear answer on what that balance should be?
I think just, like, constantly, I think just, like, practicing self-awareness and awareness of that bias, awareness of why is this thought coming up during this interaction, or
Yeah.
just perceiving something.
And do you think that balance relates to the ideas we're talking about the consistent patterns of reality that we have relationships with?
Yeah, I think that you'll see more of those patterns if you just ask yourself why more often.
Okay, so it's this attitude of inquiry.
And I think, yeah, I mean, I think obviously, like,
Yeah.
biases that might seem harmful, right?
Yeah.
Like my internalized misogyny, where it's like I'm gonna feel one way about a person because of how they dress. Like, that's not productive or helpful. But I'm not. It's not gone because I'm aware of it. But being aware of it makes it easier to interact with the world in a more positive way,
Yeah.
in an encouraging way, you know. And again, like, it is hard to verbalize and articulate these ideas because it's like people. I'm not used to having this kind of conversation, you know.
Yeah.
And I guess that's what's cool about what you're doing is like it's so essential for people to have this back and forth and ask these questions because like I've now learned something about myself.
Appreciate that.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm glad.
And I think that's empowering and cool and like exciting, and it makes me feel more ready to like walk back out there and interact with the world.
Awesome. Well, that seems like a good place to stop then.
Hell yeah.